The photograph could fool anyone into thinking time once paused out of respect. A bench worn smooth by hundreds of travelers before them waits beneath tall arched windows. The morning light slants through the haze, settling on a family whose faces seem carved from fatigue and hope in equal measure. They sit in Ellis Island's Registry Hall in the winter of 1907. Dust drifts like slow snow through the air. The baby's tag reads Novak, but the name is wrong. The father's hands rest on his cap, knuckles cracked and raw from the ship's long voyage. The mother cradles the infant so close that her breath fogs the paper tag tied to the blanket. Two older children flank them, silent. Around them, the great hall hums, languages colliding, shoes scraping against the tiled floor, the echo of officers' boots tapping through columns of waiting souls. Everyone here carries a story. Everyone is a question waiting for permission to exist. No one ever tells you how loud hope can be. Outside, the harbor wind rattles the high windows, carrying the smell of salt and coal. A few rays of sunlight break through the fog and catch the brass buttons of the inspectors' coats. It is still early. Another ship has docked, spilling more families into the hall. The Novaks, or at least the name they've been given, sit perfectly still, as if afraid that any sudden motion might make them vanish back across the ocean. The father's real name is not Novak. His papers said Nowak, a difference so small it could be mistaken for a smudge. But the clerk at the desk had written it down swiftly, carelessly, maybe thinking he was helping, simplifying the strange letters for America. And so a single letter slips, and with it a thread of history. He doesn't notice at first. After weeks at sea, names feel less important than dry bread and a place to sleep. Yet as he sits in the hall, fatigue thawing into awareness, he sees the tag around the baby's neck and feels something twist inside. That single letter changes the sound of who they are. In the language they left behind, Nowak meant new man. The version on the tag means nothing at all. He thinks of his own father, buried in a small Polish field, and the church registry that had recorded their lineage for generations. He wonders how his father would react to this slip of ink, this accidental rebirth. Perhaps he would have smiled sadly, calling it the price of crossing the ocean. The mother rocks the baby, humming a tune too soft to hear. Her scarf hides most of her face, but her eyes move constantly, tracing the enormous room. There is awe and fear in equal measure. She doesn't understand a word of English. She relies on her husband to translate, to guide. Yet even without words, she understands the rhythm of the place, the controlled chaos, the exhaustion etched into every face. To her left, a boy coughs into a sleeve. To her right, a woman prays into her hands. In front, officers with white armbands wave papers and shout instructions, their voices echoing like orders from another world. The little girl at her side, no older than 7, presses her cheek against her mother's arm. She hasn't spoken since they stepped off the boat. Her brother sits stiff beside the suitcase that carries everything they own. A pair of shoes, a photo wrapped in cloth, a loaf of bread gone hard. He keeps his eyes on the inspectors as if memorizing their movements might prepare him for his turn. For hours they sit there. The registry hall feels like both a church and a factory. The ceilings stretch impossibly high, the sunlight diffused through dirty glass. The sound of names, foreign, mispronounced, sometimes erased, fills the air like a hymn sung out of tune. At one end of the room, a photographer raises his camera, capturing moments that will outlive the people in them. Somewhere in the shuffle, someone points to the family on the bench. Maybe it's the quiet way the mother holds her child, or the worn dignity of the father's posture. Maybe it's the baby's tag, stark white against the dark fabric, bearing a name that doesn't belong. The shutter clicks. For a fraction of a second, their uncertainty becomes permanent. Later, when the father finally stands, he feels the stiffness in his legs and realizes they've been waiting nearly all day. They move toward the examination line. A uniformed officer barks something he doesn't understand. Another gestures toward the baby. The father steps forward, handing over their documents. The inspector glances at the tag, then at the paper. Novak, he reads aloud. The father hesitates, mouth half open, to correct him, but the officer stamps the form before he can speak. And just like that, the mistake becomes official. It is a strange thing to feel yourself vanish while still standing. He tells himself it doesn't matter, that a name is only a word and words can be changed. But deep down he knows that the word Nowak carried his entire past inside it. He feels its absence like a missing tooth, small but impossible to ignore. They are cleared to enter the next hall. A translator shouts their assigned number and they follow a group toward the dormitories. The boy looks up at his father. "Tata," he whispers. "Why does the baby have a different name?" The father hesitates, unsure how to explain bureaucracy to a child. "Because sometimes," he says quietly, "the world writes what it wants, not what is true." The mother hears this and tightens her arms around the baby. The next morning they will cross the narrow bridge into Manhattan, stepping onto streets that smell of smoke and horse sweat, where thousands of other families chase the same uncertain promise. But for now, they remain in that hall, a portrait of in-between, not the old world, not yet the new. If you look closely at the photograph, you can almost see the air trembling around them. The father's eyes carry something between exhaustion and defiance. The mother's lips move in a silent prayer. The children's faces are unreadable, too young to understand the scale of what has happened, too old to forget it. Somewhere above, the station clock ticks louder than the crowd. The baby stirs, then settles again, the tag brushing against the blanket. Novak. The wrong name, but one that will follow them into every form, every census, every generation. Decades later, descendants will find this photograph in an archive, perhaps in a digital scan like the one you're seeing now. They'll zoom in, tracing the sepia tones, the faint scratches, the soft glow of morning light. Someone will notice the tag and wonder, why is the baby labeled? And why does it not match the family's records? A mystery sealed in dust. The truth is that the photograph doesn't show the moment the mistake happened. It shows the moment they began to live with it. The family's story is not extraordinary. There were thousands like them. Names lost in translation, destinies rewritten by clerks who never looked up. But this image captures the precise second when anonymity became inheritance. Behind them, other immigrants shift, whisper, hold onto their bundles. A guard yawns near the door. The light fades slightly as clouds drift over the harbor. Time moves again. The father finally rises, picking up his suitcase. The wooden bench creaks. He looks one last time at the windows, as if expecting to see the sea beyond them. Then he turns toward the future, toward a city whose name he doesn't yet know how to pronounce. The mother follows, her scarf brushing against the baby's tag. She doesn't notice it. None of them do. They walk out of the frame, unaware that a century later, strangers will study their faces and invent stories about them. But perhaps the truth is simpler than any story. They were tired, afraid, and hopeful in equal measure. They wanted to believe that the world ahead would care less about the letters in their name and more about the hands that would build it. As the photograph settles into its final stillness, the air thickens with silence again. The registry hall breathes on, swallowing names, releasing new ones. Outside, the Statue of Liberty stands against the fog, holding a torch the color of old copper. The ships keep coming, the benches keep filling, and somewhere in the endless archive of human longing, the name Novak continues to echo, a small error that became an entire lineage. In the archives, the photograph stands silent, but if you listen closely enough, if you imagine the echo that lingers between those walls, you can still hear the rhythm of names being spoken, rewritten and misplaced. That day in 1907, the Registry Hall was not just a room, it was a machine that turned human lives into records. And like any machine, it made mistakes. The Novak family, or rather, the Nowak family, moved with the flow of people toward the inspection tables. The father clutched their papers, the corners damp from sweat and seawater. He rehearsed his answers under his breath, the way one rehearses a prayer. 3 children, from Kraków, destination, Buffalo, New York, occupation, bricklayer. He said it in his own tongue, over and over, afraid the words might slip away when he needed them most. The hall was a storm of language. Italian mothers shouted to keep their children close. A man from Russia argued with an officer about his luggage. An Irish boy, barely 12, tried to translate for his parents. Above it all, the sound of pens scratching against paper. Every stroke of ink decided something permanent. When their turn came, the clerk barely looked up. His name was Samuel Yates, a tired man who had processed thousands of names that week. His hands moved automatically, his voice monotone. Name? He asked. Nowak, the father said slowly, the W pronounced like a V. Jan Nowak. Yates frowned, repeating it under his breath. Novak? The father hesitated. No, Nowak, he said again, pointing to the document in his trembling hand, but the clerk had already written it down. The W had become a V. One stroke, one tiny shift of ink. To Yates it was a simplification. To the man standing before him it was an erasure. The baby whimpered, breaking the moment. The mother shushed it gently, unaware of what had just changed. Yates continued his questions. Health, money, relatives in America. The father answered them all correctly, and so, the officer nodded and stamped the paper. Welcome to the United States, Mr. Novak, he said without emotion. Jan opened his mouth to correct him again, but stopped. He looked down at his children, exhausted, hungry, frightened, and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. One letter, he thought, just one letter. He nodded, forcing a small smile. As they stepped away from the desk, the mother noticed the tag on the baby's blanket had the same mistake. It says Novak, she whispered. He shrugged. It doesn't matter, he said, though the words felt false even as he spoke them. They will not know the difference. But deep inside, He did. A man's name is more than identification. It's a bridge between where he was and where he's going. And somewhere between Kraków and New York Harbor, that bridge had broken. They found seats on a bench again, waiting for medical inspection. Around them, other families murmured prayers, arguments, promises. The father watched as a nurse passed, holding a clipboard and a small jar of ink. She stopped beside a mother with 2 children, checking for signs of fever. The baby in Jan's arms stirred, and he prayed silently that no one would ask to examine it. He had heard stories: if a baby coughed, if it cried too hard, if it looked too thin, families were separated. The thought chilled him. When their turn came, the nurse gave them only a quick glance. The baby seemed healthy enough. She nodded and moved on. Relief washed over him. Maybe the worst was over. Maybe they could finally begin again. Still, he couldn't stop staring at the tag. It was a small white rectangle, pinned neatly to the baby's blanket. The handwriting was crisp, official, Novak. He turned it over in his hand as if by touching it he could will the letters to change. But paper has its own stubbornness. He folded it once, then tucked it back against the child's chest. Later, when they were called to the registration table, another official copied the information from the tag. Novak, he said again, the name passing into another ledger, another page. Each repetition made it more real, more permanent. With every stamp, every signature, the old name faded a little more. In the corner of the hall, a young interpreter watched the process. She had seen this happen many times. Names lost in translation, rewritten for convenience. She wished she could correct them, but she had been warned before. Don't interfere. The paperwork must match. So she stayed silent, watching the family disappear into the crowd. That evening, as the sun bled through the dirty windows, the family sat near the dormitory stairs. The father handed out pieces of bread from their last loaf. The children ate slowly, too tired to talk. The baby slept, its small chest rising and falling beneath the wrong name. The mother broke the silence. "Do you think he will know?" she asked softly. "Who?" "The baby," she said. "When he grows, that his name is not ours." Jan looked at her, unsure how to answer. "Maybe it will not matter," he said at last. "Maybe it will make him safer. If he is American, they will not care who his father was." She turned her gaze toward the high windows, where the last light was fading. "Then what about us?" she whispered. He didn't reply. There was no answer. That night, he dreamed of home, of the fields outside Kraków, the smell of earth after rain. He saw his father again, standing by the door, asking him to remember who he was. But when he tried to speak his name, no sound came out. He woke before dawn, heart pounding. The next morning they lined up to leave the island. Their papers were stamped one final time, and they boarded the ferry to Manhattan. The skyline rose ahead like a wall of smoke and stone. Behind them, the Statue of Liberty glowed pale in the mist. The children pressed against the rail, staring. The mother clutched the baby tighter, the tag still pinned to the blanket. The city swallowed them whole. For months afterward, they lived in a narrow apartment above a bakery in the Lower East Side. Jan found work hauling bricks. The pay was meager, but he never complained. Every morning before dawn, he walked past other men just like him. Italians, Germans, Jews, Poles, all carrying hammers, shovels, dreams. Sometimes on his way to work, he passed a school where children recited their lessons in English. He couldn't understand the words, but he recognized one sound that made him pause. Novak, a teacher, was calling attendance. He turned toward the window just for a second before continuing down the street. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The name he thought he had lost was still being spoken, but not by him, by others, strangers. It was becoming something new, something that no longer belonged entirely to him but to the country that had taken him in. At home, his wife began signing letters with the new name. It was easier that way, she said. The neighbors couldn't pronounce the old one. Their eldest son practiced writing it, proud of the neatness of the letters. The daughter corrected her friends when they said it wrong. The baby, still too young to speak, grew up never knowing there was another version. Yet sometimes, late at night when the streets were quiet, Jan would whisper the old name under his breath, just to keep it alive. The years ahead would carry them far from Ellis Island. But no matter where they went, that single error stayed with them, a small mark that separated who they had been from who they were becoming. Some mistakes are loud, catastrophic. Others are quiet, almost invisible, but the quiet ones last the longest. The photograph remains. The bench, the father's hollow stare, the mother's tired hands, the baby with its mislabeled tag. For most people, it's just another archival image of immigrants arriving in a new land. But for those who look closer, it's something else entirely. It's a story of transformation, the instant where a name, a life, a lineage turned and never turned back again. There are many ways to disappear. Some vanish through war, some through hunger, and some simply through silence. For the Novak family, the silence began the moment the ship pulled away from Ellis Island. The ferry moved across the cold, gray water, leaving behind the island that had renamed them. From the deck, Jan watched the building grow smaller, its windows catching the light like the eyes of something that sees everything and remembers nothing. The baby slept in his wife's arms, the paper tag still attached to the blanket. He wanted to tear it off, but he couldn't. Somehow he felt that doing so would erase the last proof that they had ever existed at all. The city ahead rose like a promise and a threat. Smoke from the factories hung over the skyline. The air smelled of iron and wet rope. Children shouted in languages he didn't know. Everything was faster here. Horses clattering, trains hissing, people shouting orders in English that sounded sharp enough to cut. They followed another family to a tenement in the Lower East Side. The landlord spoke only enough Polish to point and demand rent in advance. The room was small and dark, its window facing a brick wall. The father stacked his coat on the floor for the children to sleep on. That night, the baby's soft breathing was the only sound. In the morning, the city roared awake. Jan found work through a man from Galicia, who hired laborers for the rail yards. The pay was low, the hours endless, but it was work. When the foreman wrote his name in the ledger, it came out John Novak. He didn't correct it, he just nodded, knowing the fight was pointless. The name was lighter that way, easier to pronounce, easier to forget. Every evening he returned with his hands stained by soot, his shoulders aching. His wife Anna washed clothes for neighbors, her fingers raw from lye and cold water. Their eldest, Peter, sold newspapers on the corner, learning English one headline at a time. The younger girl, Eliza, helped her mother watch the baby, whose name, Jacob, was the first word the neighbors could say correctly. They were becoming invisible, by becoming ordinary. Still, the father sometimes caught glimpses of the old world hiding in the new. On Sundays he walked with his family to a small Polish church tucked between warehouses. There, under the carved saints, he would hear the old names again: Nowak, Kowalski, Lewandowski, spoken in the right rhythm, like music. When the priest asked his name, John hesitated before answering, Nowak, but the church registry recorded him as Novak anyway. Ink obeyed its own god. The mistake was no longer a mistake. It was a beginning. Months passed, then years. The children grew into the language of their new country. Peter stopped speaking Polish at school. He said it made the other boys laugh. Eliza started calling her parents Mama and Papa instead of Matka and Tata. The baby Jacob grew up never knowing another way to say his name. Anna noticed first how the distance widened, not just from their homeland but from who they had been. The songs she sang at night lost their words. The letters they sent home grew shorter, then stopped entirely when the postage became too expensive. Their memories began to shrink like garments washed too many times. Yet sometimes, late in the night, when the city quieted and the train stopped their grinding noise, John would whisper to her, "We are still Nowak." She would nod, eyes closed, though she wasn't sure anymore if she believed him. One winter, when snow piled thick against the windows, a letter came from Poland. It was from Jan's younger brother Marek, written in careful script. The letter had traveled for months and the paper smelled faintly of smoke. It spoke of the village, of fields gone fallow, of familiar faces now buried beneath wooden crosses. It asked when Jan would come home. At the bottom, Marek had signed it, "To my brother, Jan Nowak." Jan folded the letter slowly. He read the name over and over, tracing the letters with his calloused finger. He wanted to frame it, to hang it on the wall, but instead he hid it under the mattress. It was too fragile, too dangerous to leave in sight. In this city, even a word could be stolen. The next morning, when he left for work, his wife found the letter. She read it silently, her lips trembling. When she looked at her children playing on the floor, she realized none of them would understand the words on the page. The letter was from their past, written in a language that was already fading from their home. She folded it again and placed it in the bottom of a tin box, beneath old coins and baptismal papers. The past, she thought, belonged somewhere safe and silent. Years went by. The family moved uptown, sharing rooms with other immigrants. The father's back began to bend, his hands growing slower. The children, now teenagers, teased him for his accent. They corrected his grammar gently but often. He smiled, pretending not to mind. In truth, it hurt him less than it once did. Perhaps he was learning that forgetting was also a form of survival. When Jacob turned 10, he brought home a school project, a family tree drawn in pencil on cheap paper. "Papa," he said proudly, "I showed the teacher how to spell our name. Novak. She said it's a good American name." Jan looked at the letters, the neat little branches spreading from them, and nodded. He wanted to tell the boy that once upon a time there had been a W there, that one crooked letter carried the weight of 1,000 ancestors, but he didn't. He simply smiled and said, "It is a good name." That night, after the children were asleep, he sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the city pulsed with electricity, something he still didn't quite trust. He stared at the dark glass and saw his reflection staring back, older now, his features softened by time. "Novak," he whispered to himself. The sound felt foreign on his tongue, but it no longer hurt. It was strange how something stolen could start to feel earned. The silence continued, not out of shame, but out of necessity. In America, there was no time for mourning who you used to be. The city demanded everything, your strength, your voice, even your name. And so, like millions of others, they learned to live between languages, between truths. Sometimes, though, the past found its way back in the smallest of gestures. On Christmas Eve, when Anna baked bread, she used her mother's old recipe. Though she couldn't find half the ingredients, she shaped the loaves anyway, humming the melody her mother had once sung in the fields. The smell filled the apartment, and for a moment the walls seemed to dissolve, replaced by rolling hills and birch trees. When Jan came home from work that night, he kissed her cheek and said, "It smells like home." She smiled. For a heartbeat, they were Nowak again, but the spell always broke. The next morning, the children's laughter pulled them back into the American rhythm. Newspapers, work, noise, and the old language slipped further into the cracks between their lives. In 1914, when war broke out in Europe, the family gathered around a borrowed radio. The names of cities rolled out like ghosts, places they had once known, now burning. Jan sat very still, realizing that his village might no longer exist. The war erased maps faster than ink ever could. In that moment, he understood something that had haunted him since Ellis Island. He could never go back, even if he wanted to. The old name belonged to a world that was gone. Anna wept softly. The children didn't. They couldn't understand why it mattered so much. The baby in the photograph, Jacob, grew into a tall young man with an American voice and an American heart. He joined the Navy when he was 18, fighting under the name Jacob Novak. He never knew there had been another version of him, another spelling that carried a field's worth of memory. When he wrote home from France, his letters began, "Dear Ma and Pa Novak." The name that had once been a mistake was now armor. It was his proof that he belonged. When Jan received the first letter, he held it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was strong, confident. He read the words, then the signature, his son's name, written proudly in English. He smiled, though a small ache lingered in his chest. "He's free," he told his wife. "That's what matters." Freedom, he realized, had cost them everything invisible. Their accent, their traditions, their spelling, all traded for the right to be unremarkable. Decades later, when the old man died, the local church printed his obituary. John Novak, beloved husband, father, and laborer, passed peacefully at home. There was no mention of Kraków, no mention of Ellis Island, no mention of a letter hidden under a mattress. Only the new name remained, as solid and clean as the marble headstone that bore it. Anna lived long enough to see their grandchildren born. The first boy was named Jacob, after his father. When she held him in her arms, she noticed something familiar, the same eyes, the same shape of mouth. But when she asked what the baby's middle name was, her daughter-in-law smiled and said, "Michael, we thought it sounded better in English." Anna nodded, pretending to agree. She looked down at the baby and whispered in Polish, "You carry more than you know." He blinked up at her, uncomprehending, and that was enough. The silence, she realized, had become its own inheritance, the kind passed down not through stories but through the spaces between them. Some nights, when the apartment was quiet, she would take the old photograph from the box, the one taken in the registry hall, and run her fingers over the creases. The edges were frayed now, the surface dotted with scratches, but the faces were still clear. Jan's weary eyes, her own scarfed head, the children huddled close, and the baby with the tag on its blanket. She traced the letters, Novak, and smiled through her tears. It was a beautiful mistake, she thought, a painful one, but beautiful, because it had given them a future. 100 years later, the photograph resurfaces, not in an archive, not in a museum, but on the internet, scanned by some volunteer historian cataloging immigration records. The file is labeled simply, "Family at Ellis Island, 1907, Novak." It appears on a genealogy website among thousands of others, a grainy sepia window into a moment long gone. Most people scroll past it without a second thought, but one woman stops. Her name is Rachel Novak, 35 years old, living in Chicago, a data analyst by trade and a genealogist by obsession. It's late, 2 in the morning, and she's been tracing her family line through census records, passenger manifests, and church registries. When she clicks the image open, something inside her shifts. She recognizes the shape of the father's jaw, the set of his eyes. The woman's face, tired but kind, feels like someone she's seen in old Polaroids. But it's the baby that captures her, wrapped in a worn blanket, a paper tag pinned to its chest. The tag reads Novak. She leans closer, adjusting the brightness on her screen. For a second, she forgets to breathe. Could this be them? Could this be the first photograph of her family in America? The caption gives no names, just the year and location. Ellis Island, 1907. She knows from her own research that her great-great-grandfather, John Novak, arrived from Kraków around that same time. But none of the family stories ever mentioned a photograph. Her grandmother, before she died, had spoken vaguely of the island, of how they'd come through with nothing but a suitcase and a name. But never about a baby's tag, never about a mistake. Rachel downloads the image and zooms in until the pixels blur. The tag looks like it was handwritten, maybe by an officer. The ink has faded, but the letters are clear. Novak. And for the first time, she wonders, was it always Novak? Or did someone, somewhere, write it wrong? The thought burrows into her mind. She opens another tab and begins searching Ellis Island records. The manifests from 1907 are digitized, faded pages filled with looping cursive. She finds dozens of Novaks, hundreds even, but one line catches her eye. Nowak John, age 28, occupation, bricklayer, wife, Anna, children, 3. Her heart skips. Nowak, not Novak. The difference of a single letter. She cross-references the arrival date, the ship's name, the ages. It all matches. The family in the record arrived on December 14, 1907, aboard the SS Patricia. The baby listed is Jakob, infant. She stares at the screen for a long moment, then whispers, Jakob. Her great-grandfather's name had been Jacob Novak, the baby in the photo. The tag, she realizes, must have been wrong. She sits back, goosebumps rising on her arms. A single clerk's error, a century ago, and an entire branch of her family tree had grown from it. She imagines her great-great-grandfather, exhausted from the voyage, hearing his name rewritten by someone who didn't care to ask twice. And now here she was, staring into the moment it happened. Over the following weeks, Rachel becomes consumed. She orders copies of the ship's manifest, Ellis Island inspection logs, even the original registration cards. She visits the public library to examine physical microfilms. Her husband teases her gently, saying she's falling into the past. She laughs, but he's right. There's something magnetic about it, something unfinished. One night, as snow falls outside her apartment window, she spreads the documents across the dining table. Each page is a fragment of someone's life, a line of ink, a date, a signature. She arranges them like puzzle pieces, and in the center, she places the printed photograph, the family on the bench, the baby with the wrong tag. She whispers to the picture, I found you. For a long time, she just sits there watching the faces, the father's steady gaze, the mother's protective hands, the tired children. None of them could have imagined someone looking back at them from the future, trying to give their name back. She writes an email to the Ellis Island Museum, explaining her discovery. Weeks later, a curator replies, confirming that transcription errors like this were common. Clerks often changed foreign spellings to fit American records. It's likely your ancestor's name was indeed Nowak, the curator writes. Your photograph is one of the few that captures the moment such a change occurred. Rachel reads the message 3 times. Then she starts to cry. Not sadness exactly, but something deeper. The feeling of touching history, of hearing a century-old echo answer back. She prints the curator's note and pins it beside the photo on her wall. Every morning before work, she stops to look at it. Sometimes she talks to them, the family in the image, as if they could hear her. You're home, she says softly. I found your name. But the story doesn't end there. That spring, she visits Ellis Island herself. The ferry ride feels surreal. The same gray water, the same wind, the same skyline. The old registry hall has been restored, its high windows shining with afternoon light. She stands in the middle of the floor exactly where the benches once stood. For a moment, it feels as if she stepped inside the photograph. She can almost see them, the father, the mother, the baby, sitting just beyond reach. She takes a seat on one of the wooden benches, hands trembling. Around her, tourists whisper in dozens of languages, echoing the past. She closes her eyes and imagines the sound of the clerk's pen scratching across paper, the murmur of names being bent, softened, lost. I know who you were, she whispers. In the gift shop, she buys a replica of the landing card, blank except for the Ellis Island seal. When she gets home, she writes the name Jan Nowak on it, in her neatest handwriting. She pins it beneath the photograph. For the first time in a century, the name and the face are reunited. Weeks later, Rachel posts the image online, accompanied by the story she's uncovered. The post spreads faster than she expects, shared by historians, descendants of immigrants, strangers who see their own grandparents in those tired faces. Comments flood in. My great-grandfather's name was changed, too. They took the Z out of ours. My grandmother said the clerk just wrote whatever he could spell. The photograph becomes a symbol, not just of one family, but of millions. The mistake that was never corrected becomes a reminder of how identity survives even when rewritten. That summer, Rachel's daughter, Emily, brings home a school assignment about ancestry. She asks for help tracing their family tree. Rachel smiles and opens the box where she keeps the photograph and documents. Together they spread everything across the table just like Rachel once did alone. Emily points to the photograph. Who are they? Our family, Rachel says. The baby too? Yes, she whispers. That's your great-great-grandfather. Emily leans closer, fascinated. Why does he have a name tag? Rachel hesitates, then smiles. Because someone wrote it wrong, but we remembered anyway. For a while, they just look at the image together. The sepia tones, the light streaming through the tall windows, the father's quiet dignity. Then Emily picks up a crayon and writes Nowak in big, uneven letters on a piece of paper. There, she says proudly. That's better. Rachel feels a lump rise in her throat. She hugs her daughter tightly. Yes, she says. That's better. That night when Emily is asleep, Rachel sits at her desk and writes a short note to attach to the back of the framed photograph. This is where we began. In 1907, a man named Jan Nowak arrived with his family. Someone wrote his name wrong, and for 100 years we carried the mistake with pride. But his real name still matters. It always mattered. She signs it with her name, Rachel Nowak, formerly Novak, and smiles through her tears. The next morning, she files to legally restore the original spelling. Autumn in Poland smells of earth and smoke, of things ending and beginning again. The air feels older there, as if it remembers too much. When Rachel steps off the train in Kraków, the chill catches her breath. She's never been here before, yet something about the place feels painfully familiar. The rooftops, the cobblestones, even the rhythm of footsteps, everything whispers home in a language she doesn't quite speak but somehow understands. She's carrying a single folder in her bag, the photograph, the Ellis Island record, the curator's letter, and the note she wrote months ago. On its cover, she's taped a small label that reads, Nowak Family Archive. Her journey began as curiosity, then turned into duty. But now, standing on the soil her great-great-grandparents left behind, it feels like pilgrimage. The village is an hour's drive south. The road winds through fields where the grass bends under a gray sky. A local historian named Tomasz meets her at the station, holding a cardboard sign that says Nowak, spelled correctly this time. He's a soft-spoken man in his 60s, wearing a wool coat and carrying a worn leather satchel. You are from the American Nowaks, he says in careful English. I have heard of you. The archives mentioned your inquiry. He drives her through narrow lanes lined with birch trees. The fields stretch out endlessly, dotted with small farmhouses. As they approach the village, Tomasz gestures toward a cluster of weathered buildings. This is where they came from. Jan and Anna, their names are in the parish records. Rachel presses her hand to the window, trying to imagine them walking these same paths. When the car stops near a small stone church, she feels a strange mix of reverence and sorrow. Inside, the church smells of candle wax and old wood. Tomasz leads her to a table where a thick ledger rests, its pages yellow and brittle. This is from 1880 to 1910, he says. Their marriage, their baptism record. Here, he flips carefully until the inked lines reveal it. Jan Nowak, Anna Zielinska, married, April 1902. Rachel traces the names with her fingertips. The letters are elegant, deliberate, real. For a moment the world narrows to that one page. All the distance, all the silence, collapses into this single piece of paper, proof that they had lived, that before the wrong name there was a right one. They had a brother, Marek, Tomasz adds quietly. He stayed, died in 1946. There is still one Nowak grave in the old cemetery. Would you like to see it? Rachel nods. They walk through the grass, where crooked crosses lean under the weight of years. Some graves are marked, some long forgotten. Tomasz stops at a small stone slab half buried in moss. The inscription is faint. Marek Nowak, 1884-1946. Rachel kneels, brushing away leaves. The name gleams faintly in the afternoon light. She whispers, "We didn't forget you." From her bag, she takes the photograph, the family on the bench, the baby with the wrong tag, and lays it gently against the stone. The wind stirs, and the paper flutters like it recognizes the soil. She stays there for a long time, the sound of rustling trees like distant voices. When she finally stands, Tomasz says, "Names are important here, but so is survival. Many changed theirs to live. You are lucky to have found both, the name and the story. On the drive back, Rachel watches the countryside blur past. She thinks about the baby in the photograph, her great-grandfather, growing up in a new world, never knowing this one existed. She wonders what he would think if he knew that his name had come full circle, carried back across the ocean by someone who shared his blood, but not his language. That night, she stays in a small inn on the outskirts of the city. The room is simple, a single bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the square. She spreads out her documents again, but this time, they feel lighter. The mystery is no longer heavy. It's whole. She takes out her notebook and writes a few lines, her handwriting steady despite the tremor in her chest. A name is not just a word, it's a map. Ours was rewritten by strangers, carried by generations, and now returned home. We were never lost, only waiting to be remembered. She tears out the page, folds it neatly, and places it inside the photograph's frame. When she wakes before dawn, the city is still. Bells ring in the distance. She walks to the riverbank, holding the photograph. The sky begins to lighten, the water glowing silver. Slowly, she dips one corner of the photo into the river, the Vistula, letting the current kiss the paper. Back home, she whispers. The water ripples gently, then settles, as if accepting the offering. When she returns to Chicago weeks later, she hangs the photograph in her living room. But now, it bears a small inscription carved into the frame. Nowak family, Ellis Island, 1907. The name came home. Her daughter Emily asks one evening, "Why do you keep that picture there?" Rachel smiles. "Because it reminds us where silence ends," she says. And sometimes when the sun hits the photograph just right, the faded edges seem to glow. The dust of Ellis Island's windows, the curve of the mother's hands, the faint shimmer of the baby's tag. But in Rachel's eyes, the name on that tag is already corrected. Nowak. The mistake had lasted a century. The memory would last forever.